What the Kremlin did this week crossed a line that the White House had desperately hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with fury, with precision, and with a message that reverberated from the battlefields of the Donbas all the way to the corridors of the Pentagon. Tonight, we break down everything: the masterstroke that caught Washington off guard, the red alert that followed, and the Ukrainian response that obliterated any doubt about their resolve. This is the story no one saw coming, and it is far from over. For weeks now there had been whispers, not from official channels, not from diplomatic sources, just whispers, that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a choreography that Western intelligence services had grown accustomed to reading. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the choreography went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military movements know the indicators: the surge in encrypted communications between the Kremlin and field commanders, the repositioning of strategic assets towards staging areas, the sudden cancellation of diplomatic engagements, the recall of key personnel from Western capitals. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Defense officials at the Pentagon began cross-referencing satellite imagery with signals intelligence. They noticed patterns, or rather the absence of patterns, that had only appeared twice before in this conflict. Once before the initial invasion in February 2022, once before the annexation announcements in September of that same year. Both times the silence preceded escalation. Both times Washington was caught reacting rather than anticipating. This time, they feared, would be no different. Early Tuesday morning, National Security Agency assets detected what they described as a coordinated repositioning of Russian strategic bomber units, including Tu-95 Bear and Tu-160 Blackjack aircraft that had not been moved to forward operating positions in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: preparation for a major offensive, readiness for nuclear escalation, or a psychological operation designed to fracture Western unity. Intelligence officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Moscow was changing its posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, Washington pays attention. Within hours, additional reports flooded in. Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea had altered their patrol patterns. Ground forces near Zaporizhzhia had received unusual supply convoys under the cover of darkness, and most alarmingly, communications intercepts suggested that commanders in the field were being given what analysts called discretionary authority, the kind of flexibility that typically precedes high-tempo operations. The pieces were moving, but the picture remained unclear. The red alert issued by the National Security Council late Wednesday night was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after emergency briefings, described Russia's repositioning as unprecedented in scope, deliberate in timing, and, perhaps most importantly, designed to exploit a perceived window of Western distraction. With political tensions in Washington consuming bandwidth, with European allies focused on domestic crises, Moscow appeared to be gambling that now, right now, was the moment to change the facts on the ground. But strategic gambits only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response this week was among the most aggressive and coordinated we've seen since the liberation of Kherson. Here's what we know. Within hours of the NSC alert reaching Kyiv, Ukrainian forces launched a multi-domain response that caught even their allies by surprise. These weren't the standard drone strikes or artillery barrages. These were precision operations involving long-range ATACMS missiles, naval drones, and special operations units that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian logistics hubs across occupied Crimea and the land bridge connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Targets included the Kerch Strait ferry terminal, which had recently been reinforced after bridge damage, and which analysts believe was being prepared as an alternative supply route. The Jankoy Air Base, home to Russian attack helicopters and recently upgraded runway infrastructure. Ammunition depots near Armyansk that were likely preparing to support the very offensive Russia was positioning for. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit the fuel. They hit the ammunition. They hit the command and control nodes that would have coordinated any large-scale push. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's potential offensive, the logistics that would have made it operational, the communications that would have synchronized it, the supplies that would have sustained it. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of preparation that could overwhelm Ukrainian defenses if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike random targets. They didn't waste precision munitions on propaganda hits. They hit the arteries. They hit the brain. And they did it within a window so narrow that Russia's air defense systems barely had time to respond. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest repositioning was designed to test the cohesion of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and budgetary debates in European capitals. Moscow wanted to see whether NATO would fracture under pressure. They wanted to see whether Ukraine would hesitate without immediate reassurance from its allies. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for permission. They launched a response that was so swift, so decisive, that even Russian military bloggers took notice. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. They've grown accustomed to controlling the narrative, to setting the tempo of this conflict. But today, Ukraine dictated the tempo. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's repositioning as coercive signaling, a way to pressure Ukraine's partners into counseling restraint. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and autonomous. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian reinforcements were caught mid-transit. The timing matters because it shows intelligence superiority. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian moves, they are anticipating them. They are inside Russia's decision cycle. And that terrifies Moscow more than any single weapon system ever could. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Naval drone units carried out at least 3 separate attacks on Russian vessels in the Black Sea, forcing the remnants of the Black Sea fleet to retreat further toward Novorossiysk. Air defense suppression teams targeted radar installations that had been upgraded in the last 6 weeks, installations that Russia believed were secure. Special operations forces operating deep behind enemy lines reportedly disrupted rail lines used by Russia to move heavy equipment toward the front. This wasn't just a counterattack, this wasn't just retaliation, this was strategic interdiction, this was battlefield shaping. And battlefield shaping is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed northern offensive in the war's opening weeks. For every advance they have made in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in the grinding attritional battles that have defined this conflict, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their logistics, their planning, their very ability to sustain operations. Tonight was the latest and perhaps most dramatic example. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall within a week. They thought Ukrainian resistance would collapse once Western attention faded. They thought sanctions would be lifted. alliances would fracture and time would favor the aggressor. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukrainian forces are striking deeper than ever before. Western support, despite the political noise, continues to flow. And Russia's military, once feared as the world's second most powerful, is struggling to maintain momentum against a nation a fraction of its size. Moscow miscalculated, and they continue to miscalculate because every time they believe they've found a weakness to exploit, Ukraine responds with something that resets the equation. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Russia's latest repositioning happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Hardliners in his inner circle want escalation, believing that only maximum force can salvage the campaign. Pragmatists want negotiation, fearing that continued attrition will hollow out Russian military power for a generation. Oligarchs want sanctions relief, watching their fortunes evaporate while the war drains state resources. And the Russian public, despite propaganda saturation, is growing weary of a conflict that has no clear end in sight. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing a wartime economy that is beginning to show cracks. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they need a win, any win, to maintain the illusion of control. Tonight, Ukraine denied them that win. The White House red alert, now circulating among NATO allies and shared with congressional leadership, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian coercion to succeed. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's force repositioning was inconsistent with any credible claim of defensive intent. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to pretend otherwise. You don't usually hear that tone from the National Security Council unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further, noting that the United States would continue to support Ukraine with the capabilities necessary to defend its sovereignty, a phrase that many interpreted as a signal that additional weapons transfers may be forthcoming. Moscow predictably dismissed the warning as hysteria, but the speed of Ukraine's subsequent strikes suggests that Kyiv took it very seriously indeed. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a brief but pointed speech tonight. He said, they thought our resolve would weaken. They were wrong. He said, every missile they prepare, we will find. Every depot they fill, we will empty. And he said, Ukraine does not wait for aggression to arrive. We meet it before it departs. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who is determined to demonstrate that Ukraine will not be intimidated into submission. Zelensky's tone tonight was notably defiant, a contrast to some of his more diplomatic recent appearances. It was the voice of a nation that has been pushed to its limits and has decided to push back harder than ever. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's repositioning wasn't isolated. Along with the movement of strategic bombers, Belarus conducted unusual military exercises near its southern border, raising questions about whether Minsk might once again serve as a staging ground. Russian cyber units launched probing attacks against Ukrainian power infrastructure, testing vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a coordinated assault, and Iranian-supplied Shahd drones increased their sortie rate by nearly 40%, targeting civilian infrastructure in what appears to be a terror campaign designed to break Ukrainian morale. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether that larger plan has now been disrupted by Ukraine's preemptive strikes remains to be seen. But what is clear is that Moscow was coordinating across multiple domains, and Ukraine responded in kind. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia was preparing for a major winter offensive, hoping to capitalize on difficult conditions and potential gaps in Western support. Another is that the Kremlin was attempting to force a diplomatic opening, using military pressure to bring Ukraine to the negotiating table on unfavorable terms. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia was testing the threshold for Western intervention, probing how much escalation NATO would tolerate before becoming directly involved. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for guidance from Washington. They didn't seek permission from Brussels. They didn't telegraph their response. They acted. And in acting, they sent a message that was heard in every capital that matters. Ukraine fights its own battles. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether it can outlast Western patience and Ukrainian resilience. Ukraine wants to show that time is not on Moscow's side, that every month of continued resistance weakens Russia's position. Washington wants to prevent escalation while maintaining support for Kyiv. And Europe wants to prevent the conflict from spilling beyond Ukraine's borders while managing its own economic strains. All of these objectives are in tension, and tonight's events have raised the stakes for every single one of them. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command channels for signs of how Moscow will respond. They say there is confusion in Russian military communications, a possible indicator that Ukraine's strikes disrupted coordination more than initially assessed. They say satellite imagery shows secondary explosions at several targeted sites, suggesting ammunition or fuel was destroyed. And they say Russia's decision to reposition strategic assets is likely part of a broader intimidation campaign intended to fracture the Western coalition. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, rapid, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that aggression will be met with immediate consequences. And it sent a message to Washington that Kyiv remains a capable partner worthy of continued support. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this repositioning. What we do know is that Washington's red alert was timely. It galvanized the Ukrainian response. It signaled to allies that coordination remains intact. And it put Moscow on notice that its moves are being watched. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next several days. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit, another miscalculation in a war full of them. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, that readiness was on full display. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalibrating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Moscow learns something they have learned many times, but refuse to accept. Ukraine does not break. Ukraine does not bow. And Ukraine does not wait to be attacked. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Washington's warning was heard. Kyiv's response was devastating. And Russia's masterstroke has been met with a counterstroke that may well have changed the trajectory of this conflict. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.